Diego started with two things, a hammer and a second front door. I wasn't chasing millions. I just wanted peace and no rent. He worked construction by day and studied cash flow at night. No suit, no shortcut, just sweat and strategy. Financial Freedom Files. Full story now, playing on Dollar by Dollar. Watch the full story. Retired at 42 with NO degree. Diego Ramirez stood at the top of the driveway, hands on his hips, staring at the house like it had just asked him a question. It was a squat little thing. Beige siding warped by the sun, a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, and a stubborn front door that only closed properly if you lifted it at the right angle. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a tired oak in a yard whose roots had cracked the sidewalk into seams. But it had something else. A second front door. Off to the side, hidden behind an overgrown bush, was a separate entrance. Faded red paint. A dusty screen door. It was nothing fancy, just a side porch with concrete steps. But it meant something Diego couldn't quite name yet. He didn't know the term for it, but he felt it. Opportunity. That was how it started. Not with a plan. Not with a spreadsheet or a vision board. Just a man in steel-toed boots looking at a house with 2 doors and thinking, what if? Diego was 24 then. He'd been working construction since he was 18. Framing jobs mostly. Long days, sunburned arms, splinters in his hands and grit under his nails. He liked the work. Liked building something he could see. But he knew his body wouldn't last forever. Every older guy on his crew had the same story. Busted knees, bad backs, work until they dropped. No one had savings. They just kept going, hoping Social Security wouldn't run out before they did. Diego didn't want to hope. He wanted options. But that was the problem. He didn't know what his options were. He hadn't gone to college. Not because he wasn't smart. School just never felt like his world. He liked working with his hands, being outside, making something. But he hated feeling stuck. Like no matter how hard he worked, he'd always be one twisted ankle away from disaster. So he saved. Quietly. Every week, no matter how small. He didn't eat out. Drove a beat-up Nissan. Lived with his mom until he had $10,000 in the bank. And when the opportunity came, a coworker's uncle selling a house, as is $442,000, Diego didn't hesitate. He didn't know what he'd do with it yet. Just knew he needed something. A foothold. A place to start. That was the house. The one with 2 doors. He moved in a week later, alone. The place smelled like mildew and regret. Carpet so old it crunched underfoot. But it was his. He fixed the leaks, resealed the windows, tore out the carpet, sanded the floors, painted every wall by hand. He didn't know what he was doing half the time, but he learned. YouTube videos, forums, trial and error. The back room, the one with the second door, he left alone. Until the night his cousin Julian got laid off from the machine shop and asked if he could crash for a bit. Diego paused, looked at the second door, then asked, "You want your own entrance?" They rigged it up together, added a lock, rearranged the back room, put in a tiny fridge, a microwave, a curtain for privacy. It wasn't glamorous, but Julian had a place to stay, and Diego had a revelation. He charged him $300 a month. Not much, but enough to cover the mortgage. That was the moment. The light bulb. Diego didn't know it then, but he had just discovered house hacking, living in one part of property and renting the other to cover costs. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a tool, a lever, a way out. Over the next year, he kept working construction, but his weekends went into learning. He read books he didn't understand at first. Rich Dad, Poor Dad, The Millionaire Real Estate Investor. Watched videos with words like cash flow and cap rate and depreciation. He didn't get it all, but the message was clear. Own assets. Let them pay you back. He got a second job on the weekends, demo work. Piled all the extra cash into repairs. Replaced the water heater. Retiled the bathroom. Upgraded the electrical panel. And when Julian moved out, he listed the back room on Craigslist. He called it a studio with private entrance, $650 per month. It rented in 2 days. And suddenly Diego wasn't just a construction worker. He was a landlord. A small-time one. A humble one. But a landlord, nonetheless. That year changed everything. Diego started tracking every dollar. Bought a budgeting notebook and logged his expenses by hand. Rent from the studio paid the mortgage. His full-time income. All savings. In 18 months, he saved enough for another down payment. He bought a duplex. Live in one unit, rent the other. Repeat. By age 28, he had 3 units. At 35, some were ugly. All of them were affordable. He looked for places most buyers ignored. Small leaks, outdated kitchens, peeling paint. He didn't mind the work. He had the skills. And he never over-leveraged. Always 20% down. Always cash flow positive. His friends didn't get it. Why not buy a nicer place? Why not get a truck? Why are you always fixing toilets? But Diego wasn't looking for flash. He was buying freedom. Every time a unit got rented, he saw the number in his head. $750, $950, $1,100. That wasn't rent. That was time. Each tenant bought him a sliver of independence. A few more hours he didn't have to sell his body to a job site. A few more days closer to retirement. He never called it retirement, though. Just choice. The choice to work. Or not. To travel. Or stay. To help family. Or rest. And by the time he turned 42, he had that choice. 6 properties. 11 units. No mortgage on 4 of them. A monthly income of just under $9,000. More than enough. More than he ever imagined when he stood in that cracked driveway, looking at a house with 2 doors. The first time Diego bought a tool that wasn't for work, it felt strange. It was a Stanley tape measure. Bright yellow, smooth retract, the kind construction workers use all the time. But this one wasn't for a job site. It was for his own hallway. The hallway of his house. Diego stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, carefully measuring the length of a wall that had once been covered in soot-stained wallpaper. His calloused fingers pulled the tape taut, marked a note on a legal pad, then stepped back with a little nod. It wasn't just a wall anymore. It was square footage, usable space, a factor in rental value. He was learning to see things differently now. Back on the job, the guys joked about retirement like it was a fairy tale. A punchline. Something only lucky people talked about, or rich people planned for. The old-timers smoked behind the shed, backs aching, boots off, grumbling about taxes, wages, gas prices. But Diego's mind was elsewhere. He kept his notebook in his lunchbox. A blue spiral-bound one, scuffed on the edges, filled with rough math and printouts from real estate forums. Property listings circled in pen. A page labeled, "Why a Duplex Pays Double." Another with a sketch of how to convert a laundry room into a kitchenette. Every break, he'd read. Every night, he'd study. He wasn't just building walls anymore. He was building a blueprint for freedom. It was slow work. Lonely, too. His mother didn't get it. "You bought another broken house?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Diego Mijo, you don't even have a nice couch." He didn't. His living room had a folding chair, a used bookshelf, and a coffee table made from 2 cinder blocks and a scrap door he sanded himself. His bed was a mattress on the floor. But he didn't mind. He saw what no one else did. That money spent on a nicer TV or dining table wasn't really spent. It was lost. Money he could have put toward roof repairs. Or another down payment. "Live poor to live rich later," he muttered one night, eating beans and rice off a paper plate. Then he wrote it in the corner of his notebook. Underlined it twice. His second property taught him the hard part of landlording. Tenants weren't always easy. The upstairs couple in his duplex fought loudly. The man refused to shovel snow from the shared walkway. The woman left bags of trash on the porch for days. Diego didn't know how to enforce boundaries. He'd show up timidly, hat in hand, trying to be friendly and firm at the same time. They didn't renew the lease. He learned from it. Installed clearer rules in the lease agreement. Started screening more carefully. Used templates he downloaded online. Taught himself the local rental laws word for word. "You're becoming a lawyer now," Julian had joked. "No, just not getting sued," Diego replied. He still worked construction full-time, but weekends were all business now. Saturdays were spent at Home Depot, elbows deep in plumbing parts. Sundays, he mowed 3 lawns, patched drywall, and installed window locks. By 27, he had his third property, a small single-family house in a rough part of town. Everyone said not to buy there. Too risky. Too run down. But Diego knew something they didn't. The city had approved a new public transit route nearby. In 2 years, that street would have a bus stop. In 5, maybe a bike lane, new coffee shops, rising rent. He bought it anyway. Cash flow positive from day one. The tenant? A single mom with 2 kids, just like the woman who used to babysit Diego when he was little. He lowered the rent by $100 below market just to keep it affordable. You're not going to make money like that, his co-worker said. I'm already making enough, Diego shrugged. And he was. His monthly income from tenants covered more than his living expenses now. He reinvested most of it. Repairs, savings, a small emergency fund. But the rest? He used to help. Paid for his sister's textbooks. Took his mom to a dentist she'd been avoiding for years. Bought Julian a car when his broke down. No one asked for help. He just gave it. Not because he felt rich, but because he remembered what it was like to feel stuck. And he was learning that wealth didn't have to be flashy. Sometimes wealth looked like giving someone else a chance to breathe. That was the year Diego's foreman noticed something different. You taking days off now? The man grumbled one Thursday morning. What's with all the PTO? Diego just smiled. I've got appointments. The foreman rolled his eyes. Doctors. Bankers. He was refinancing. After 3 years of careful saving, consistent rent payments, and home improvements, his credit was solid. His equity had grown. And his banker, an older woman who liked his notebook full of spreadsheets and duct-taped receipts, helped him consolidate a loan to buy his 4th property. It was a triplex. 3 doors. 3 chances. Diego moved into the smallest unit. Rented the other 2. At work, the joke started. Mr. Monopoly. Hey, landlord. You raising our rent too? But Diego just laughed. He didn't care. His hammer still swung the same way. His boots were still muddy. He still carried drywall on his back. But something had shifted. He had time now. Choices. Leverage. When one of his coworkers slipped on rebar and busted his shoulder, Diego visited him in the hospital. Sat quietly by the man's side while they talked about insurance. Time off. Bills piling up. The man sighed. Wish I had a backup. Diego nodded. Then asked carefully, You ever thought about house hacking? The man blinked. House what? That was the moment Diego realized something else. The foreman taught him how to frame a wall, mix concrete, run a line straight. But no one had ever taught him what to do with the money he earned. No one had taught any of them. They worked 50 hours a week. Some made $25 an hour. But it all disappeared. Into trucks, into takeout, into bar tabs and broken relationships. Diego started to talk more. Quietly. Just one-on-one. At lunch breaks. On job sites. In the passenger seat of a borrowed truck. He didn't preach. Didn't boast. Just ask questions. You ever think about renting out your basement? You ever heard of FHA loans? You know you can get a duplex with just 3.5% down? Sometimes people listened. Most of the time, they didn't. But Diego kept planting the seeds. And one day, a guy from drywall came up and said, Hey, you think you could help me run some numbers on a property? Diego nodded and handed him a fresh notebook. Diego Ramirez didn't think of himself as a real estate investor. Not yet. Even with 3 properties under his belt and a triplex in the works, he still saw himself as a construction guy with a side hustle. His jeans still had drywall dust ground into the knees. His phone screen was cracked. His lunch was still a peanut butter sandwich and wax paper. But something had shifted. He no longer looked at buildings as just places to live. He looked at them like levers. Quiet machines. Structures that could turn time into money. Debt into cash flow. Sweat equity into choices. The duplex changed everything. It wasn't his first property, but it was the one that taught him how fast momentum could build once you stopped making excuses and started making decisions. He found it on a Tuesday night. He wasn't even looking, just scrolling listings while eating leftovers. He liked to check the distress section of local real estate sites. Properties listed as is, usually full of problems no one else wanted to deal with. This one caught his eye because the numbers didn't make sense. 2 full units. Side by side. Separate entrances. Roof recently redone. Listed at $78,000. He stared at the screen. There had to be a catch. The next morning before his shift, he drove by the address. It sat on a quiet street, just outside the city line. Brick exterior. Faded shutters. Patchy lawn. The porch sagged a bit, and someone had duct-taped the mailbox shut. But the structure was sound. Diego could tell from the way the foundation settled. From the trim around the windows. It wasn't pretty, but it had good bones. He called the number. The owner picked up on the second ring. An older man named Dennis who lived out of state and wanted to get rid of the place. The tenants were leaving. He didn't want to hassle anymore. Said he'd take $70,000 if Diego could close fast. Diego didn't blink. He drove to the credit union on his lunch break. Called his lender. Ran the numbers. With the cash flow from his other units and a little help from a $203K renovation loan, he could make it work. Barely. But the risk felt different now. It didn't feel like gambling. It felt like leveling up. By Friday, he had the offer in. By Monday, it was accepted. 30 days later, he was holding the keys to a property that would launch the next phase of his journey. That duplex taught him more than any book or blog ever could. The first lesson? You can't wait for perfect. One unit was livable, the other was a mess. Water damage in the kitchen. A raccoon had chewed through insulation in the attic. The back bathroom had no floor. But instead of backing out or waiting until he had more money, Diego rolled up his sleeves. He moved into the worst unit, rented the better one immediately. The rent covered the mortgage. That was the trick. He didn't have to be rich. He just had to be strategic. He made a list of repairs and tackled them one by one. After work, on weekends, late nights with a headlamp and a podcast playing while he laid tile on his knees. He learned how to install cabinets from YouTube, how to hang drywall from a retired neighbor named Charles who stopped by and saw him struggling. "Boy, you're going to waste half a sheet doing it that way," Charles had said, chuckling. Diego smiled and handed him a drill. 2 hours later, they'd finished the kitchen together. Charles became a regular after that, offering tips, sharing stories, lending him a belt sander. The old man had never invested in real estate, but had remodeled more homes than Diego could count. "You're smart," Charles said one day, sipping iced tea on the porch. "Not just book smart, pattern smart." Diego tilted his head. "Pattern. You see where things lead. Most folks don't. They see a broken toilet. You see rent." That stuck with him. Diego started to track more than just income and expenses. He tracked patterns. What types of units rented faster? What repairs boosted value the most? Which neighborhoods were quietly changing? He became a student of movement. Not just housing, but people, demographics, transit, migration. He read zoning notices, showed up at city council meetings, learned how to predict where the money would go next. By 29, he was earning over $4,500 a month from rentals, still living in a unit that smelled faintly of primer and plywood, still packing his lunch. But now he had savings. And more importantly, he had clarity. The second lesson from the duplex? Momentum is exponential. One property pays for the next. One lesson prevents the next mistake. 1 month of discipline creates a year of options. He used the equity from the duplex to buy his next building, a fourplex on the edge of town. The seller had inherited it and wanted out. The units were half vacant. Rent was under market. Appliances were ancient. Diego saw it like he always did. Not as it was, but what it could be. He offered $142,000. They accepted. He used a portion of his savings and a HELOC, home equity line of credit, from the duplex to fund the down payment and repairs. It was the biggest risk he'd taken. He was scared, really scared, but the math was solid. He got 2 units cleaned and rented within 60 days. The others followed. One tenant worked in landscaping. Another was a nurse. One was a single dad with a toddler. Diego didn't raise the rents all at once. He improved the units first, made them safe, clean, respectful places to live. He believed in fairness, knew what it was like to be nickel and dimed by landlords who didn't fix anything. He fixed everything, then set expectations clearly. The tenants appreciated it. They stayed. Diego learned the value of turnover rates, vacancy loss, maintenance schedules. He built a system, created spreadsheets to track when filters needed changing, when leases were expiring, when lawn service was due. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. That year, he earned his first $50,000 in rental profit. He didn't buy a new car, didn't take a vacation. He bought tools, a wet saw, a new miter, an inspection camera. Then he did something else. He took a week off work, unpaid, and taught himself how to file as an LLC. Learned about depreciation, Schedule E, and what the IRS allowed landlords to write off. He wasn't playing small anymore. He was building a machine. Still quiet, still humble, but powerful. The third lesson? Time isn't money. Time is leverage. Most people traded time for money. Diego used money to buy time. And with that time, he learned, practiced, invested, scaled. He no longer worried about being able to work at 60. He was planning what he'd do when he didn't have to work at 40. One duplex, one pattern, one decision after another. The dominoes had started falling, and Diego was ready to tip the next one. Diego Ramirez didn't wear success on his sleeve. By 31, he owned 7 rental units across 3 properties, and not a single person on his job site knew. He still parked in the back of the lot, still showed up in the same sun-faded hoodie, still brought peanut butter sandwiches for lunch. But he no longer had to. That was the difference. He had begun to understand the weight of quiet wealth. It was a particular kind of freedom, not the Instagram kind, not the startup founder kind, not yachts or Teslas or private jets. No, it was walking into the grocery store and not looking at the prices. It was being able to replace a broken fridge without panic. It was knowing that if his back went out, if a boss yelled, if the world shifted, he'd still be okay. His wealth wasn't visible, but it was strong. A portfolio of units that cash flowed every month. A system that sustained itself. Repairs were budgeted for. Vacancies prepared for. Tenants respected him, not because he acted like a big shot, but because he fixed things when he said he would. Because his word was solid. Because the houses he offered were clean and dignified. By now, Diego had a rhythm. He was still working his construction job full-time, but weekends had become business days. He kept a whiteboard in his bedroom, scrawled with to-do lists for every property. Unit 3B, caulk tub, replace porch light at 1726 Ridge. Lease renewal due October 15th. He color-coded everything. Rent due dates, repairs, savings goals. He had a spreadsheet that projected 5 years out, another that tracked which tenants paid on time and which ones didn't. He used Google Drive like it was a second brain. Every month, he ran his numbers by hand, even though apps existed. It made him feel grounded, connected. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were fuel, motion, leverage. And yet, there were moments of doubt. He still had imposter syndrome. Still heard that little voice. Who are you to think you can retire early? What if the market crashes? What if a tenant trashes everything? Those fears came late at night, when the house was quiet and the ceiling fan creaked, and the spreadsheet glowed on his laptop. He fought them with discipline. One habit stacked on another, like bricks in a wall. That year, he did something that changed everything. He took a week off work, paid time off he'd been hoarding for 2 years, and flew to Indianapolis. Not for vacation, for research. He'd been watching out-of-state rental markets, noticing where population was growing, where housing was tight, where job growth was climbing. Indianapolis had come up on multiple lists. He walked neighborhoods, talked to locals, visited open houses posing as a buyer, took notes on building codes, landlord-tenant laws, property taxes. He even met with a local property manager, someone he'd connected with on a real estate forum. The woman, Jeanette, had been in the business for 18 years. "You don't look like most of my clients," she said with a raised brow. Diego smiled. "That's fine. I don't act like most of them either." She laughed. By the end of the trip, she agreed to manage a property for him, if he found the right one. 3 months later, he did. A brick 4-unit on the east side. 2 vacant. 2 below market rent. Listed at $152,000. He made the leap. His first out-of-state investment. Everyone warned him not to. You can't fix it if it breaks. What if the tenants ghost? What if the manager quits? But Diego had built a system, a budget, a reserve fund, and he trusted himself. He closed the deal, used a cash-out refinance from one of his earlier properties to fund the purchase. And when those 2 vacant units got cleaned up and rented, the property was cash-flowing $800 a month, even after management fees. It was the first time Diego realized he didn't have to do everything. He could delegate. Systems, people, strategy. He started dreaming bigger. What if he could own 20 units? What if he could replace his entire construction income? What if by 40 he could step away? But with every dream, the work continued. He still caulked bathtubs, still shoveled snow, still did midnight calls when pipes froze, because he believed in building strong foundations. Literally and metaphorically. One weekend, Diego sat on the porch of his triplex, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The sun was just rising. A tenant's dog barked in the distance. A delivery truck rumbled by. He had a moment of peace. No one knew this porch belonged to him. He didn't need them to. That's when he wrote a line in his notebook that would define everything going forward. Don't build for applause. Build for escape. It became his motto. He wasn't building for admiration. He was building to leave. Not to vanish, but to be free. To not trade his spine for a paycheck. To not age into regret. to not wonder if he could have done more. He started reading more. Books on real estate tax advantages, podcasts about financial independence, case studies of teachers, baristas, truck drivers, people like him who found the escape hatch. And then it happened. The number. That magical, hard-earned, spreadsheet-proven number. The one that showed him he didn't need the day job anymore. By 34, with 11 units and $6,200 monthly net income after all expenses, he was financially independent. The first time he realized it, he just sat there, frozen, staring at the number. He didn't cry, didn't cheer. He just breathed, deep, slow, silent, because he knew it wasn't luck. It was bricks, time, discipline, compound decisions. He didn't quit his job that day. He waited another year, built more margin, bought one more property, set up auto payments, met with a CPA. But at 35, on a gray Tuesday morning, Diego handed in his resignation letter. The foreman looked confused. "You sick?" "No," Diego said. "You get offered another job?" "Nope." "Then why you leaving?" Diego smiled softly. "I've got something else to build." And just like that, he walked away. Not because he had to, but because he could. Diego Ramirez never thought the hardest part of freedom would be the silence. Not silence in a sad or lonely sense, but new kind of quiet. No alarm clocks blaring at 5:15 a.m. No foreman yelling across job sites. No sound of steel-toe boots on gravel before dawn. No endless scroll of job tickets taped to the trailer wall, telling him what he'd be doing for the next 12 hours. It was the silence of space, of ownership over his time. The morning after his last construction shift, Diego woke up naturally, for the first time in over 15 years. Light filtered in through the thin cotton curtains of his bedroom. Birds chirped. His hands were stiff, but not aching. He stretched, rolled out of bed, and made himself coffee with the same care he once reserved for drywall seams. He sat on the porch with his chipped mug and stared out over the neighborhood he once thought he'd never afford to live in. And then he pulled out a pen. Because retirement didn't mean stopping. It meant shifting. And the first shift, creating a new kind of budget. He called it the freedom budget. Not because it was about spending extravagantly, but because it was about designing his life on purpose. For years, Diego's budgeting strategy had been defined by sacrifice. Rent first, repairs second, groceries third. Everything else could wait. His early years were built on delay, delaying comfort, delay gratification, delaying purchases until they made sense mathematically. But now, the question wasn't what can I cut? It was what matters now. So he started simple. 3 new categories: joy, health, time. He decided 10% of his monthly rental income, about $620, would go toward these categories every month. And every month, he'd choose how to divide it. 1 month, joy, meant buying a used road bike off Craigslist. Another, it was flying his mom to Santa Fe to see her sister for the first time in 12 years. Health started with basics, replacing old sneakers, getting a gym membership, finally booking physical therapy for a nagging shoulder injury from years of hauling rebar. Time in outsourcing. He hired a local teenager to mow the lawns at 2 of his rental properties. Started using a property management app to streamline maintenance requests. Scheduled automatic bill payments. Bought a label maker. Little things. But they mattered. Because now, freedom wasn't just about money. It was about energy, margin, ownership over his day. And here's what shocked him most. Without the day job, his expenses dropped. No more commuting 40 minutes each way. No more eating out because he was too tired to cook. No more chiropractor visits just to function at the job site. His body began to heal. He cooked real food again, learned new recipes, started a garden in the side yard using raised beds he built himself from reclaimed wood. For the first time since he was 18, he had full days to himself, and he filled them with intention. Mornings started with movement, a walk, a bike ride, light stretches in the living room while a podcast played softly in the background. Afternoons were for projects. He painted a unit, updated another with vinyl flooring, fixed a dripping sink. Not out of desperation or obligation, but because he wanted to, because the work had changed shape. It wasn't survival now. It was stewardship. He cleaned his tools more often, sharpened his blades, even reorganized his tool shed into label bins and pegboards. A neighbor named Linda walked by one morning and said, "You finally retired." Diego laughed. Something like that. She narrowed her eyes. You're too young for retirement. He shrugged. Maybe I just got good at budgeting. The truth was, Diego was redefining what retirement looked like. Not golf courses and cruises, but time, autonomy, the ability to say yes or no without fear. But there were challenges, too. Emotional ones. He hadn't realized how much of his identity had been tied to the job, to the rhythm of punching in, clocking out, joking with the guys, eating lunch on overturned buckets next to lumber stacks. He missed the camaraderie sometimes. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the hum of generators in the morning fog. So he found new rhythms. Started volunteering at the community tool library once a week, teaching basic carpentry to teens and young adults. Many of them came from families like his, hard-working, limited resources, no clue where to start financially. He saw himself in them. Quiet kids. Kids who didn't think they were school smart. Kids who just needed someone to show them another path. He brought in a binder one day with photocopies of his spreadsheets. A simplified version of his freedom budget. A chart showing how $650 in rent from one unit could become $200,000 over 10 years, if managed well. They stared at it like it was magic. Wait, you don't have to be rich to do this, one asked. Diego shook his head. You just have to be consistent. Another kid raised his hand. How do you start? Diego smiled. You live like you're broke. Save like your life depends on it. And when the right door shows up, open it. That line stuck. He started writing again. Not for business. For reflection. He kept a notebook by the bed and filled it with insights. Debt is a cage, but it's made of paper. Compound interest is gravity in disguise. A budget is just permission to spend with purpose. You don't need 6 figures. You need 6 habits. One page simply said, be the man your past self was praying for. And every time he doubted, he read those pages back. Some nights, he'd walk through his old neighborhood, past the first house he bought, the one with the 2 doors. The siding had been repainted by the new owner. The porch no longer sagged. He'd sold it 2 years prior to a young couple with a baby on the way. Took a small profit and reinvested in the triplex. But he always felt something walking past it. That was where it all began. Where he first stood holding a key and realized wealth wasn't about money. It was about agency. That house had taught him more than school ever did. And so had budgeting. Real budgeting. Not just cutting back, but cutting through. To what matters. To the life you want to live. He called it vision-based budgeting. Every dollar had to serve the future. Every expense had to be weighed against the life he was building. It didn't mean deprivation. It meant design. He wasn't rich, but he was free. And to Diego, that meant everything. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when Diego Ramirez realized he was invisible. Not in the tragic way. Not in the lonely, overlooked, forgotten by the world sense. It was a different kind of invisibility, chosen, controlled, almost strategic. He sat at the corner table of his favorite coffee shop, sipping an Americano, flipping through the local housing market report. Around him, laptops clicked, baristas shouted orders. Earbuds dangled from the ears of commuters writing emails at 8:30. Nobody knew him. Nobody pointed at him and said, that guy owns 14 rental units. Nobody whispered, that man hasn't had a 9-to-5 job in 7 years. To them, he looked like anyone else. Hoodie, notepad, coffee, calm. And that's what struck him. He wasn't doing anything flashy, but he had everything he needed. He didn't wear wealth. He used it. That week, one of his fourplex tenants moved out. The place was in decent shape, just needed paint, carpet, and a good deep clean. Diego didn't stress. He'd already set aside a turnover fund. It was part of the system now. But instead of diving in alone like he used to, he tried something new. He hired someone. Eli, 23, a part-time community college student who'd left a resume in Diego's mailbox after seeing him repaint a porch a few months back. I'll work hard, the note read, and I'll learn fast. Diego had saved it. And now, he texted him. 2 days later, they were standing in the empty unit, moving paint cans. Eli was green. He didn't know the difference between satin and eggshell. Took too long to tape the trim. Missed a patch on the ceiling Diego had to quietly redo after. But he had something else. Curiosity. And Diego knew what that was worth. They worked in silence most of the time. Classic rock playing on an old Bluetooth speaker, the rhythmic scrape of brushes filling the space. At one point, Eli paused and asked, "So, how many places do you own?" Diego glanced over, mildly surprised. He hadn't mentioned it. 14 units, he said simply. Eli's eyes widened. Whoa, like houses. Duplexes. Triplexes. A few singles. Eli stared. Diego handed him a fresh roller. "You want to learn?" The kid nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." And so it began. Not a mentorship. Not formally. Just quiet guidance. Diego told him about house hacking. Showed him how he ran spreadsheets. Explained the 1% rule and how cash flow beats appreciation when you're starting small. He showed Eli his first budget, his first envelope system, his first scam lease. Eli started staying late after the jobs were done, just to ask questions. Did you ever almost lose everything? Were you scared the first time you raised rent? What happens when the water heater dies and you've got no money? Diego answered every question with the same calm tone. Yes, yes. And that's why you always budget repairs before you need them. It reminded him of himself at 24, watching YouTube videos at 2 a.m., wondering if he was insane for buying a moldy 2-bedroom with no savings left in his account. Back then, there was no mentor, just trial, error, persistence. And now here he was, the quiet millionaire, painting baseboards with a kid who thought FHA alone was a brand of furniture. That night, Diego walked home, hands still speckled with white paint, and sat on his porch again. The air smelled like jasmine and sawdust. A tenant's baby cried in the distance. A dog barked. Sprinklers clicked on in a neighbor's yard. He thought about legacy, not the kind written in wills, but the kind passed through actions, habits, notebooks. He didn't have children of his own, had never married, not because he didn't want to, it just hadn't happened yet. Life had been full enough already, and he never liked the idea of rushing into anything he couldn't care for properly. But this quiet knowledge transfer, this was a seed, a living legacy, and he wanted to do more of it. So he made a list. Things I wish someone had told me at 22. Money buys time, not happiness. Budgeting isn't punishment. It's self-respect. Owning one property will teach you more than 100 YouTube videos. The goal isn't a number. It's freedom. Buy based on math. Rent based on humanity. He shared the list with Eli the next week. Printed it out. Laminated it. The kid folded it into his wallet like it was a golden ticket. Diego smiled. The next few months passed in a rhythm he'd grown to love. Wake up. Stretch. Coffee. Check the property manager dashboard. Do a few maintenance calls. Lunch. Read. Walk. Cook. Watch the sunset. Reflect. Sleep. Freedom wasn't glamorous. It was just consistent peace. But that peace didn't stop him from working. Diego's version of retired didn't mean idle. He started a tiny side hustle, consulting for other blue-collar workers who wanted to learn real estate. Not a flashy YouTube channel. No courses. No funnels. Just real humans. Conversations. Coffee shop meetups. Shared spreadsheets. Simple advice. The referrals grew fast. A plumber. A waitress. A guy from drywall who remembered Diego's old beat-up notebook and finally reached out. They all said the same thing. I didn't know someone like me could do this. And Diego always replied, you just didn't know the rules yet. That became his core belief. There are people out there who don't need more money. They need better information. So he gave it. He designed a downloadable one-page starter plan. From $0 to first door. A blueprint for working-class investors. And he gave it away for free. It included a simple budget template, FHA loan walkthrough, how to screen tenants, how to run cash flow math on the back of a napkin, a mindset checklist. Are you ready to live below your means for 5 years to escape the rat race forever? He didn't try to go viral. He tried to go real. And people responded because they were tired of financial advice that assumed everyone had 6 figures in savings or rich parents to help. They wanted someone who knew what it meant to skip meals to save for a down payment, who knew what it felt like to sand cabinets at midnight after a 10-hour shift just to rent a unit in time to make mortgage. That was Diego, and he wasn't preaching from a stage. He was just walking the walk, quietly. Month by month, the results kept compounding. He hit 20 doors by age 39, $11,400 net monthly income, 0 debt except for 1 low-interest mortgage. His net worth, over $1.4 million. But no one ever saw it coming. Because he still drove the same dented Toyota pickup, still wore jeans with paint on the cuff, Still walked into coffee shops invisible. Until, one day, Eli sent him a photo. It was a screenshot. A rental listing. First units rented. Thanks, D. You changed everything. Diego stared at the screen for a long moment, then put the phone down, and smiled. The payoff was never the money. It was the moment someone else realized. If he could do it, maybe I can too. In every financial journey, there's a moment when the numbers feel like quicksand. A day when the confidence you've spent years building begins to tremble beneath your feet. For Diego Ramirez, that day came on a Wednesday morning in late 2020. The world had already changed. Shut down storefronts. Empty bus stops. Headlines filled with fear. The pandemic had reshaped how people lived, worked, and more importantly, how they paid. Rent collection was no longer a checkbox. It was a gamble. Diego sat at his kitchen table, one of those handmade butcher block styles with sanding marks still visible on the legs, holding a spreadsheet in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. For tenants had already messaged him. Job loss, reduced hours, can't pay full rent this month, maybe next. Two had already missed rent completely. That was $2,300 unaccounted for. He wasn't panicked. Not yet. But his jaw was tight. His reserves were healthy. He had always followed the rule. 6 months of expenses, minimum, across all units. But seeing those unpaid rows pile up felt like gravity shifting under his system. The market was dipping. Confidence everywhere was eroding. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Diego questioned the entire premise of his empire. Was this house of cash flow as stable as he believed? Would the dominoes fall backward? He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The silence was heavier than usual. He remembered something a podcast guest had said months ago. Real estate rewards the patient, but it punches the arrogant. Diego had never been arrogant, but he had grown comfortable. He'd stopped checking in with his tenants regularly, stopped revisiting his emergency scenarios, stopped refining the basics. So he went back to them. First, he called every tenant, personally. No managers, no emails, just a quiet voice and a willingness to listen. Are you okay? Can you pay anything this month? What do you need? Some were honest. One tenant offered to mow lawns in exchange for a rent deferment. Another could pay half now, half in 2 weeks. One cried on the phone, ashamed to admit she had nothing. No savings, no options. Diego didn't shame her. He built a plan. Split her rent over 4 months. Waived late fees. Created a payment plan on paper. That month, he collected 68% of his expected rent. Not enough to cover everything. But he didn't panic. Instead, he activated the system he had designed but never tested. He paused all non-essential upgrades, deferred non-critical repairs, trimmed the joy and time budgets by half. He called his insurance broker and negotiated policy adjustments. He built a new tab in his spreadsheet labeled Survival Mode. Every expense ranked. Every tenant's risk level color-coded. He wasn't scrambling. He was adapting. But the market wasn't done. One of his properties, the fourplex, had a pipe burst in the upstairs bathroom. Water poured into the lower unit like a faucet turned on full. The tenant sent photos at 6:42 a.m. Water everywhere. Diego threw on boots, grabbed his toolkit, and drove across town. He spent the next 5 hours knee-deep in drywall and shop vac sludge, pulling soggy insulation from the ceiling and trying to keep the tenant from completely losing it. That night, exhausted, he sat on his porch and exhaled through his teeth. This wasn't how he imagined financial freedom. But here's what surprised him. He still didn't regret leaving his job. Because even on the worst day, he wasn't answering to a boss. He wasn't on a clock. He could show up fully because this was his. And that was a shift. Real financial freedom wasn't about sitting back while money flowed in. It was about choosing your response, owning your outcome, weathering storms with a system, not emotion. He remembered a phrase his old foreman used to mutter during concrete pours. Strong foundations don't crack when it rains. So Diego strengthened the foundation. He revised every lease, added pandemic clauses, adjusted his application process to include employment verification with backup proof, set aside an additional 2 months of operating expenses from his emergency fund. He spoke to a mentor, an older investor he'd met through his property manager in Indianapolis. Don't panic, the man said over the phone. Do what others won't do right now. While they're scared, you clean up. You systematize. You build. And that's what Diego did. He walked every unit, made a list of deferred repairs, and slowly began knocking them out, himself. Not to save money, but to understand better where the stress points were, where tenants hesitated to report issues, where the costs were creeping. He also started tracking tenant sentiment. Every interaction, every complaint, every praise. He built a tenant communication sheet, asked his manager to log interactions, studied patterns, created tenant satisfaction scores. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he understood now a stable portfolio is built on human trust. And that meant managing emotions, not just spreadsheets. 2 months later, something shifted. The messages slowed. Rent started coming in on time. One tenant called him just to say thank you. Another left a card in the mailbox. Thanks for working with us. No one else would have. Diego held that card for a long time. He had never felt prouder, not even when he hit 20 units. Because this wasn't about owning properties. It was about showing up when it counted. The storm passed. By the end of the year, his rent collections were back to 92%. Not perfect, but solid, sustainable. And more importantly, his system had survived its first test. That winter, Diego updated his financial freedom binder, added a new section called Crisis Playbook, printed out a copy of the rent forbearance agreements he'd designed, wrote a reflection titled, "The Day the Market Dipped and I Didn't." In it, he wrote, "Your systems will save you if you build them before the fear comes." That became the phrase he shared most in the months that followed. He returned to his coffee shop mentorships, sat across from nurses, drivers, security guards, people like him a few years back, and told them what he'd learned. He told them the truth. That freedom isn't always peaceful. That sometimes, even when you're retired, you mop up ceiling water and file insurance claims and stretch emergency funds with surgical precision. But if you build it right, freedom holds. Because it's not just a number in a bank account. It's the confidence to stay calm when others run. It's the power to say, I planned for this. It's the understanding that the dip isn't the end. It's the test. And Diego passed it. Quietly. Resiliently. Without panic. Because long before the market dipped, he'd already done the hardest thing. He believed he could. And then he built it. Brick by brick. Unit by unit. Budget by budget. Discipline by discipline. The next year, he bought a new triplex. Cash. Didn't tell anyone. Just added it to the binder. And kept going. Because that's what freedom looks like in real life. By 41, Diego Ramirez had grown comfortable with being underestimated. He still wore the same work boots most days, scuffed, broken in, quiet on pavement. He still packed lunch when he left the house, still kept a wrench set under the back seat of his pickup, still ran his numbers by hand every Sunday morning with a cup of black coffee in reach. People didn't recognize him as wealthy, and that was the point. He'd built a life no one could take from him. Not because it was invisible, but because it was intentional. But something curious started happening that year. He noticed that people, neighbors, tenants, acquaintances, kept asking him the same question. Aren't you done yet? Done what? Diego would reply. Buying places. Working on houses. Running all this stuff. He'd shrug. Maybe. Maybe not. Because the truth was, Diego had reached every goal he had ever set. He had hit 20 rental units. Was netting over $12,000 per month in passive income. Had no consumer debt. Had paid off the last of his personal mortgage. Had a 6-figure reserve fund spread across high-yield accounts and laddered CDs. He could stop. Today, he could rent a cabin in the mountains and spend his days chopping firewood and reading paperbacks if he wanted to. But he wasn't ready. Not because he wanted more stuff, but because he still believed in the rule of one more. It was something he'd written in his notebook years ago. You're always one unit away from breakthrough. One decision away from mastery. One step from changing someone else's life. That principle had carried him through every phase of his journey. One more property. One more budget update. One more cold call to a seller no one else followed up with. And now, he wasn't chasing money anymore. He was chasing impact. It started small. He'd created a simple one-sheet guide called The Rule of One More for the small group of working-class investors he mentored. It laid out 3 core questions. What's one more unit that could unlock financial breathing room? What's one more skill you can learn this month that increases your income potential? What's one more person you can teach what you've already learned? He printed it on cardstock, handed it out in coffee shops and barber shops and community centers, left a stack at the public library bulletin board. People started reaching out. Not influencers, not realtors, real people, bus drivers, factory workers, hairstylists, single moms with part-time jobs. They weren't looking for a shortcut. They were looking for a system, a way out. Diego met with them, one by one, over coffee, in park pavilions, on plastic chairs outside rental units. He was repainting. He listened, asked questions, gave real answers. He didn't sell anything. He didn't want to. He believed that if one more person could live with less fear each month, that was wealth enough. One of those people was Renee. She was a 38-year-old postal clerk who had inherited her grandmother's home, a crumbling 2-bedroom on the south side, and didn't know what to do with it. She couldn't afford to live there, couldn't afford to fix it, didn't want to sell it. "I want to make it work," she told Diego, "but I feel like I'm drowning." He walked the property with her. It had a back room with a separate entrance. Sound familiar? He showed her how to separate utilities, how to use a $203K loan for improvements, how to market it as a studio. He even helped her draft her first lease. Within 4 months, she was renting the back unit for $700 a month. She sent Diego a voice memo after the first payment hit her account. "I slept through the night for the first time in a year. Thank you." Diego listened to it twice, then saved it. That was the rule at work. One more, and it wasn't just about real estate anymore. He began hosting what he called porch sessions at his triplex. Every second Saturday of the month, folding chairs would appear, a whiteboard, a cooler of iced tea, and 8 to 12 people from the community. No credentials, no prep, just people who wanted to learn. Topics rotated. How to read a lease. How to set up a budget. What the heck is a credit score, and why does it matter? How to open a high-yield savings account when you only have $15 to start. And every session ended the same way. Each person had to say what their one more was. "I'm going to pay off one more credit card. I'm going to cancel one more useless subscription. I'm going to call one more bank and ask better questions." And the ripple began. One day, an old friend from Diego's construction days stopped by. Edgar. They hadn't spoken in years. Edgar was still on the crew, still waking up at 5, still doing good work. But he looked tired. Word got around. Edgar said, "You retired?" Diego smiled. "I stopped working for other people. Still working, though." Edgar scratched his head. "You think I could ever do something like that?" Diego didn't answer immediately. He walked inside, came back with a fresh notebook, handed it over. "Start here." 3 months later, Edgar was house hacking a small duplex on the edge of town. "I didn't know this was allowed," he told Diego one night over tacos. "It always was," Diego said. "We just didn't know the rules." That phrase became something of a mantra. He had it printed on stickers. We just didn't know the rules. He left them at gas stations, laundromats, mechanic shops, places where working people passed through, places that didn't hand out financial literacy. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be useful. And this was the legacy, not a foundation, not a charity, just the transfer of knowledge, of habits, of power, the kind of wealth that isn't measured in zeros, but in confidence. And so he kept going. Bought one more triplex, property number 21, not because he needed the cash flow, but because a former student, a single dad named Jamil, needed a co-signer. Diego bought it in cash, put it in Jamil's name on contract, and held the note until Jamil could refinance on his own in 2 years. They called it a handshake loan. Jamil cried the day the title transferred. Diego didn't say much, just smiled, nodded. Another ripple. One more. That spring, he updated his own financial plan for the first time a year. It was simple now. Maintain, mentor, model. The wealth was solid. The portfolio stable. His reserves were healthy. His taxes were optimized. But his time, that was his biggest asset. And he planned to spend it the same way he spent his money. With intention. He bought a camper van. Started traveling 1 week in a month. Met other financial independents. Blue-collar retirees who had built their exits one wrench, one paintbrush, one budget at a time. He journaled more. Walked more. Watched sunrises from parking lots with thermoses full of coffee. And every once in a while, he'd stop and ask himself, "What's my next one more?" The idea of enough haunted Diego Ramirez more than he expected. Not in a dark or obsessive way, but like a shadow that stretched behind him, longer with every property he bought, Every month the rent cleared. Every time someone told him how amazing his journey was. He was 42 now, retired in every traditional sense of the word. He hadn't clocked in for nearly 7 years. He had passive income, zero debt, a paid-off home, and a notebook so full of systems it could have been mistaken for a franchise manual. But still, that question lingered. Is it enough? Not enough money, not enough units, but enough living. Because when you build your whole identity on progress, sometimes you forget to pause, to sit in what you've built, to become what you were working toward. Diego noticed it on a Wednesday, a completely unremarkable Wednesday. He was standing in his kitchen, chopping vegetables for soup, when it hit him. He couldn't remember the last time he went a whole day without looking at Zillow, without checking for the next deal, without calculating a cap rate in his head out of habit, without mentally filing someone's house as a good candidate for a duplex conversion. He set the knife down and leaned on the counter, staring at the steam rising from the pot. He had spent 15 years escaping the rat race. But had he built himself a different kind of race instead? That night, he took a walk around the block. No podcast, no headphones, no agenda, just his steps, his breath, the trees shifting in the breeze. He passed a new mural, painted by a group of local teens he'd once mentored. Bright, wild colors. Letters that read, "Your freedom gives me permission to chase mine." He stopped, stared, and felt the truth settle in his chest. He wasn't building any more for himself. He had enough. Now he needed to define what it meant to live inside that enough. He went home and made 3 lists. Enough things. Enough time. Enough purpose. The first list was easy. He didn't need more clothes. He already wore the same 10 shirts and 3 pairs of jeans he always had. He didn't need a fancier car. His Toyota still purred like a cat. He had enough tools, enough furniture, enough space. The second list took longer. He asked himself, how much time each week do I actually want to give away? To mentoring, to maintenance, to community, to travel. Not out of obligation, but because he chose to. He settled on 30 hours. Roughly 4 days a week, 6 hours a day, with total control over when and how. That was his new full-time schedule. Not for survival, but for service. The third list, the hardest, forced him to sit still. What was his purpose now? Money was no longer the point. Property wasn't either. It came to him slowly, written across 4 pages of journaling and 1 long sunrise. His new purpose was to protect working-class dignity by helping ordinary people build extraordinary financial lives. That was it. Simple, specific, unshakable. That night, he slept deeper than he had in months. From that point on, Diego became more deliberate. He stopped expanding his portfolio, told his property manager in Indianapolis he was done acquiring new doors. Instead, he focused on maintaining the life those doors had bought him. He turned down 2 partnerships, sold off 3 units to tenants who had expressed interest in ownership, refused to over-optimize. No Airbnb experiments, no cash-out refinance to chase faster growth. He was done with more for more's sake. He wanted enough with clarity. One afternoon, he sat down with Eli, now 26, and the proud owner of 4 units of his own. They sat on Diego's porch, watching a squirrel try to outrun its own tail. "I think I'm going to pause for a while," Diego said. Eli looked up. "Like, no more buying?" "Yeah, I've got enough." Eli blinked. "Isn't that boring?" Diego smiled. "Only if you think progress is the point." Eli frowned, tilting his head. "What's the point then?" Diego took a long sip of tea. "Peace. Stability. Being useful." He paused. "And not making your whole life a staircase you never stop climbing." Eli nodded slowly, letting that land. "I guess I always thought the goal was more doors." Diego shrugged. "Sometimes it is. Until it's not." That fall, Diego hosted a quiet event he called the Enough Gathering. 12 people. Backyard fire pit. Lawn chairs. No presentations. No tech. Just people who had hit their version of financial freedom. Whether there was one paid-off house, a part-time job they loved, or a side hustle that paid for their kids' school. The rule was simple. No bragging. No scaling. No strategizing. Only reflections. And every person had to answer 2 questions. What does enough look like to you now? What have you neglected on the road to get here? The answers were like poetry. Enough is not being scared when my car makes a weird sound. Enough is being able to buy my mom flowers without checking my account. Enough is sleeping through the night. Enough is sitting still. And the second answers? Time with my daughter. Time for my body. My spiritual life. My art. My health. Diego wrote them all down, printed them on a banner, and hung it in his tool shed. This is what wealth sounds like. 1 month later, Diego finally took the trip he'd been putting off for years. Not Paris. Not Costa Rica. Just the coast. A cabin near Big Sur. No reception. No email. Just pine trees, surf, fog in the mornings, and stars at night. He sat on the back deck, blanket over his legs, cup of tea steaming on the railing, and stared into the silence. And for the first time, truly, he felt free. Not because he owned more, but because he needed less. Not because he could outrun fear, but because he had outgrown it. Not because he won some financial game, but because he had rewritten the rules. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, washing the sky in soft oranges and lavender clouds, Diego pulled his notebook from his backpack. On a fresh page, he wrote, "Enough is not the end of growth. It is the beginning of presence. I no longer chase. I steward. I no longer hoard. I give. I no longer grind. I guide." He underlined it, then closed the book, leaned back, and let the quiet do the rest. For most of his life, Diego Ramirez had believed freedom came from opening doors. The front door of his first house, the one with appealing red paint and the second entrance. The back door of his triplex where he built his first passive income stream. The garage doors he fixed himself on the duplex he house-hacked at 27. The landlord office door he opened for the first time when tenants began addressing him with that title, not out of obligation, but out of trust. He had walked through door after door, crossing thresholds not just into rooms or buildings, but into versions of himself. But he never expected the most powerful door to be one he chose not to open. It was an email, innocently titled, Subject, Partnership Opportunity, $2.8 million portfolio. He almost deleted it. It looked like spam at first. A broker from a nearby city offering a partial stake in a 19-unit apartment complex just outside of Sacramento. Clean records. Cash flow positive. Mid-tier tenants. Recently renovated units. Turnkey. You'd only need to bring $400K, the email said. Owner financing possible. Management in place. Easy expansion to 30 doors in 2 years. And Diego could afford it. It wouldn't even strain his liquidity. He read the email again and again. Then he stared at it. He could do it. Easily. It would make him more money. It would grow his portfolio. It would level him up. But then something tugged at him. A small voice. One he'd grown used to listening to. Is that what you're here for anymore? He sat with that. Closed his laptop. Didn't respond. Instead, he went for a walk. Same quiet block he'd walked 100 times. Same cracks in the sidewalk. Same old oak that dropped acorns like clockwork in October. But everything felt different now. Because he realized, the man who would have jumped at that deal 5 years ago, that Diego was gone. Not dead. Just complete. Fulfilled. The new Diego wasn't chasing a number anymore. He was protecting his space. His time. His peace. He went home and opened his freedom binder. Flipped to the mission tab. Read the words aloud. To protect working-class dignity by helping ordinary people build extraordinary financial lives. Nothing in that sentence said scale as fast as possible. Nothing said grow until you're burned out. Nothing said chase until your peace fractures. He closed the binder and smiled. He didn't need to grow. He needed to deepen. That week, he started a new project. One that had nothing to do with property. He called it the table. It was simple. A refurbished workbench, placed in the center of his garage. 6 chairs. 1 shelf of books. A bulletin board with pinned-up notes from past students. Every Wednesday at 6 p.m., he opened the door and waited. Sometimes only one person came. Sometimes 8. One night, nobody came at all. He stayed anyway. Drank coffee. Read from a dog-eared copy of Your Money or Your Life. Because the point wasn't the attendance. It was the invitation. The invitation to sit. To talk. To learn without shame. To ask questions you were too embarrassed to Google. To be around someone who looked like you. Talked like you. Used to be you. But who made it out. That's what Diego had become now. A lighthouse. Still. Rooted. Reliable. Seen from far away by people who didn't even know they needed direction until they were drifting. One day, a woman named Carla came to the table. She was 44, divorced, worked at a dental office, made $22 an hour. She'd lived in the same apartment for 9 years, never missed a payment, but had never saved more than $400 at a time. My son just turned 18, she said, fingers knotted. And I realized I have nothing to give him, not even a map. Diego didn't speak right away. Then he leaned forward. You ever played dominoes? She blinked. Yeah. Why? You know how the first tile matters most. She nodded. Well, you're the first tile. She cried. Not out of sadness, but recognition. She wasn't too late. She was first. And first is the hardest. They started meeting one-on-one. He helped her build her first real budget. Taught her how to split her direct deposit into 2 accounts. How to build a rainy day fund, even if it was only $15 a week. Then one day, she asked about buying. He didn't say yes. Didn't say no. He said, let's walk the numbers. And they did. For 3 months. She bought her first condo 6 months later. Not flashy. Not big. But hers. And her son helped her paint the bedroom. Another door. Another life changed. Another first tile tipped forward. In his own home, Diego made a new shelf. Just above the bookshelf, across from the tool rack. On it, he placed small frame cards. Each one bore a name and a date. Renee, November 2021. First tenant, back unit rented. Eli, June 2019. 4 units in 4 years. Carla, February 2024. First home purchase. The shelf grew slowly. But every name meant a ripple. Every name meant a cycle broken. Every name meant someone, somewhere, now had a map they could hand down. That shelf became more precious to Diego than any net worth statement. It was the legacy that could never be taxed, never be foreclosed, never be market corrected. It was freedom multiplied. On his 43rd birthday, Diego didn't throw a party. He took a solo road trip. 3 days up the coast. No GPS. Just a paper map, a box of tapes, a notebook, and a camera. He stopped in small towns, ate diner food, talked to old mechanics, bookstore clerks, veterans with sunburned faces and sharp eyes. He asked them the same question. What was the moment you felt free? One said, when I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. Another, when I finally told my boss to shove it. A third, the first night I slept in my car and realized I wasn't scared anymore. Diego took a photo of each one, wrote their answers on index cards, pinned them to the inside of the van. By the end of the trip, he had 29 stories. He called it the Freedom Archive. When he returned, he added his own. A simple sentence, scrawled in black ink on a plain white card. I felt free the day I said no to more and yes to stillness. He pinned in the center, then closed the van, and walked back into the life he'd built, not to chase another door, but to hold it open for the next person who needed one. There was a rhythm to Diego Ramirez's mornings now. Wake up before the sun. No alarms, just the natural call of quiet. Brew a pot of dark roast. Stand barefoot on the kitchen tile while it percolated. Walk out onto the porch with the first mug in hand. Breathe. Listen. It was ritual, not routine. But every so often, something shifted that silence. On this particular morning, it came in the form of a text. From Julian. Yo, you got time this week? Need to talk. Face to face. Diego hadn't heard from Julian in almost 8 months. Not because anything had gone wrong. Just time. Time had scattered them like dry leaves from the same branch. Julian had been one of the first. The first person Diego had ever rented to. Back in a house with 2 doors. Back when $300 a month felt like a miracle. Back when they both thought house hacking was some kind of burglary term. Julian had stayed in Diego's life for years. Helped with tile jobs. Painted units. Showed up to move furniture and unclog drains when Diego was just starting out. But life had tugged them in different directions. Julian started his own drywall crew. Moved into a 2-bedroom with his girlfriend. Had a daughter. Gained weight. Lost it. Got a new truck. Started missing calls more often. Then radio silence. And now this. Face to face. Diego texted back. Friday. 4 p.m. tables open. When Julian pulled up, Diego was already outside, sanding a chair someone had dropped off for the community porch nights. His truck rumbled up the driveway. Tires slow, windows down. Same gray Silverado. Slightly more dense. Julian stepped out. Bigger than Diego remembered. Not just in size, something heavier in the way he moved. His hoodie sleeves pushed up to the elbows. faded tattoos visible. Eyes tired. He said, with half a grin. Still got that same notebook. Diego smiled. Still got the same coffee, too. They sat under the shade of the carport. No one else was around. Julian didn't speak for a long moment. Just looked around. You ever think about how weird this is? Diego raised a brow. You. Me. This place. You were the guy who used to eat instant noodles and track water bills down to the cent. Now you got this whole operation. You're like, I don't even know. Low-key real estate monk. Diego chuckled. Didn't do it alone. Julian nodded, but his smile faded. That's why I'm here. A beat. I didn't do it. I didn't stay the course. I bought a new truck. Took the overtime. Put off the savings. Never bought the duplex. Told myself I had time. Now I'm 44. Kids in middle school. Rent went up again last month. My back shot. And I'm scared, man. The last word broke something open. Scared. Not a word men like them were raised to admit. But it sat heavy between them, honest as the wind. Diego didn't flinch. You're still breathing, he said. Julian looked up, confused. You're still breathing. Which means you've still got leverage. It's not too late. Julian shook his head. I got nothing to leverage. You got trust. I trust you. You've done the work before. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from knowledge. That's worth more than a down payment. Julian's eyes welled. He rubbed them with the back of his hand. I'm not asking for money, D. I know. They sat in silence for a while. Then Diego stood, walked inside, and returned with a binder. The same kind he used with everyone. Only this one had Julian's exit plan already printed on the front. You knew I was coming. Diego smiled. I knew one of us would. They worked on it for weeks. Julian showed up every Sunday after his shift. They rebuilt a budget, reviewed debts, calculated how much he could save per week if he cut the streaming services, the takeout, the bar tabs. They ran rent-to-income ratios, identified nearby duplexes under $220,000. Julian called 3 lenders. Got pre-qualified for a VA loan through his dad's military service. You sure this'll work? It'll work if you work it. They visited properties together. Diego coached him on what to ask sellers, how to look past paint colors, how to inspect water heaters and window seals. Julian learned to run the math. Cap rate, cash-on-cash return, vacancy rates. He started sleeping with a calculator on his nightstand. 2 months later, he put in an offer on a triplex. It needed work, but nothing they couldn't handle. The seller countered. Julian accepted. He called Diego at 11:42 p.m. and whispered into the phone. I did it. Diego smiled in the dark. I know. The closing date arrived on a cold Tuesday in November. Julian brought his daughter to the signing. She wore a sparkly backpack and carried a pink folder filled with drawings. One was of a house with 3 doors. This is where Daddy's going to work now, she told Diego. Julian wiped his eyes. I'm never letting this go, he whispered. Diego clapped a hand on his shoulder. You're not. You're just getting started. That day, they unlocked the first door together. Not just the property, but the one inside Julian that had been locked since he first said, I'll do it later. Later had arrived, and it was right on time. That night, Diego sat at his own table. Alone. No coffee. No guests. No agenda. Just a pen and a fresh page. He wrote, some people leave. Some people loop back. But the ones who never leave, they're the roots. The reason. The mirror that reflects just how far we've come. This isn't a solo journey. It's a ripple field. And sometimes the first ripple takes a decade to return. He added Julian's name to the shelf. Date, November 14th. Label, first door, second chance. They leaned back and exhaled. Because in all his years of building, all his nights with a calculator and a cold dinner, all his flipped units and late-night tenant calls and ledger sheets, nothing had ever meant more than that. The ones who never left. There's a kind of humility that settles in after you've won the game you weren't supposed to be playing. Diego Ramirez had built a financial life so steady, so functional, so quietly self-sufficient that it rarely needed tending. By 44, his system ran like clockwork, rents deposited automatically, maintenance calls routed through his property manager, leases tracked and renewed with digital alerts and templates. His inbox was clean, his calendar mostly open, his cash flow smooth. By all outward measures, he had arrived. But that's the thing about financial independence. It frees you from urgency, but not from introspection. Because once you stop surviving, you start asking deeper questions. The question Diego found himself facing in the middle of a sunny March afternoon, seated alone in a half-empty diner with a plate of huevos rancheros and a lukewarm coffee, was this: have I stayed too small? It wasn't ego speaking. It was curiosity. For years, he had said no to growth, no to scaling, no to larger deals, bigger risks, partnerships. He'd chosen peace over profit, clarity over clout. But now, as the waitress refilled his coffee and asked if he wanted dessert, Diego thought about all the people he hadn't yet reached. All the hymns still out there, working overtime, paying rent late, wondering if this was all life had to offer. What if he had more to give? What if the cost of staying small wasn't financial, but missed opportunity? He paid the check, left a generous tip, and walked to his truck in silence. That night, he opened the oldest notebook he still owned, the one with water stains on the back and graphite smudged across the pages, the one that held his first real budget. He flipped through it slowly, letting the past rise like smoke. Page 3. Goal: buy one property. Live for free. Page 9. Stretch goal: 5 units by 30. Page 15. Financial freedom equals no boss plus no rent plus no fear. All of it had come true. And yet, nowhere in the early pages was there a line that said, teach others. Create a model. Turn what you learned into a map. Those came later. But now, maybe it was time for that to become the center. 2 weeks later, Diego stood in front of a rented library meeting room with folding chairs, a whiteboard, and 27 faces staring back at him. He hadn't advertised, just posted a single message in the neighborhood app. Free real estate workshop for working class locals. No sales, just strategies that help me retire at 42. He expected 5 people. Instead, the room was packed. There were waitresses, Uber drivers, janitors, one security guard, a mechanic, a mother of 3 who worked at the DMV, a man who sold fruit from a truck on the weekends, a retired city bus operator who just wanted to know what to do with the $40,000 he had in his savings for the first time ever. They didn't want fluff. They didn't want spreadsheets. They wanted stories. So Diego told them his. The house with 2 doors. The side hustle with purpose. The moment when one more unit turned into a portfolio. But he didn't sugarcoat it. He told them about the clogged toilets, the broken water heaters, the stress of vacancy, the nights he almost walked away. And then he told them why he stayed. Because I decided fear wasn't going to pick my future for me. The room was quiet. People nodded slowly. Some took notes. A few wiped tears they didn't expect. He ended with a promise. I don't have a course. I'm not selling anything. But if you want help, I'll help you. For free. As long as you put in the work. That became the rule. He called it the MAP project. Each participant was given a starter folder, a printed budget template, a list of FHA lenders in the area, a one-pager on cash flow math, a login for a free online calculator, a handwritten note from Diego. You don't have to know everything. You just have to begin. The workshop became monthly, then bi-weekly. By summer, it was weekly. He kept it small, never more than 30 per session. People started carpooling from 2 counties away. A church group offered their basement as a permanent space. A retired teacher offered to organize the admin. And still, Diego charged nothing. He covered the cost of printing, coffee, and whiteboard markers himself. Because he remembered what it was like to look at $10 and think, that's 5 gallons of gas or 1 frozen pizza. He refused to put a paywall between people and freedom. One night, after a workshop, a woman named Teresa approached him. Do you ever think about going bigger? She asked. Diego blinked. What do you mean? Like YouTube, or a podcast, or teaching online? You got something people need. Diego hesitated. He'd always preferred quiet impact. One conversation at a time. One binder at a time. But Teresa's words echoed. You've got something people need. That week, he recorded a single video. On his phone. No script. No editing. Just Diego, sitting at the table, telling the story of how he bought his first house on a construction worker's income with no college degree and no financial advisor. Just a notebook, discipline, and time. He uploaded it to a blank YouTube account with a title that read, I retired at 42 with no degree. Here's how. And then he forgot about it. 2 weeks later, the video had 17,000 views. Then 58,000. Then 113,000. Comments poured in. I needed to hear this today. I'm 39, broke, and just opened a notebook. Finally, a real person telling the truth. Subscribed. I'm in tears. This is the map. Diego sat in stunned silence. It wasn't about virality. It was about validation. Proof that staying small wasn't the only way to stay true. He didn't want to build a brand. He wanted to build bridges. So he started recording every Tuesday. Short, raw videos. How to talk to your landlord like a future investor. My $27 grocery list when I was saving for my first down payment. How to find a duplex no one's looking at. The envelope system that helped me retire early. You're not stupid. You're uninformed. Let's fix that. No music. No fancy lighting. Just truth. And it worked. Not because it was polished, but because it was possible. Because people saw Diego, saw the flannel shirt and the rough hands and the paint on his jeans and said, that guy looks like me. Maybe I can do it too. By the end of the year, the MAP project had helped 64 people buy their first property. Almost all were working class. Most had been renters their entire adult lives. 3 had used VA loans. 7 used the FHA house hack Diego once taught on a napkin. 2 partnered on a triplex together after meeting at the table. 1 woman bought the fourplex she'd been cleaning for years. Each of them sent a photo when they closed. Each photo went up on the wall of firsts in workshop space. Right next to Diego's original budget, framed under glass. Right next to a small wooden sign that read, the cost of staying small is who you didn't reach. And Diego stood in the middle of it all, humble as ever. Same boots, same flannel, same calm voice. But something inside had shifted. He was still small in presence, but he was big in impact. And that, he realized, was the best kind of wealth. There are numbers that live in spreadsheets, and there are numbers that live in your bones. Diego Ramirez had spent most of his life inside the first kind, tracking every rent payment, calculating every ROI, measuring every square foot of tile. But sometime around his 45th birthday, something shifted. He started noticing the other numbers, the quiet ones, the ones that didn't live in Excel, but in people's lives. $41. That was how much was left in the account of a young man named Deshaun, one of Diego's MAP project students, after he paid rent, gas, and groceries. He showed it to Diego at the end of a workshop session. Is it even worth budgeting this? He asked, embarrassed. Diego looked him in the eye and said, that $41 is your dignity fund. Every dollar you give a job to is a vote for the man you're becoming. That landed hard. Deshaun took that $41, split it into 3 envelopes, and started a side hustle fixing bikes in his neighborhood. 2 months later, he paid off a payday loan. 6 months after that, he had his first $1,000 in savings. That was the math Diego believed in now. Not compound interest for its own sake, but the compound effect of belief, dignity, and forward motion. Because in the world Diego came from, dignity wasn't just about pride. It was about power. The power to say no to a toxic boss because your bills were covered. The power to decline overtime and still make rent. The power to take your kid to the park on a Tuesday afternoon and not feel like you were stealing time from your responsibilities. Diego had tasted that power. And now, his mission was to make sure others could too. But it wasn't always easy. Because teaching dignity wasn't like teaching credit scores or rental math. It required trust, patience, listening more than talking. One of the toughest cases he'd ever worked with was Marisol, single mom, 2 kids, 3 jobs, a skeptical stare that could peel paint off a wall. She sat in the back of the workshop the first time she came, said nothing, took no notes. Diego watched her. She came back the next week. Same seat, same silence. Then a month later, she raised her hand. I don't believe any of this works for people like me. Everyone went still. Diego didn't flinch. He walked to the whiteboard and erased what he'd written. Okay, he said. Let's start from your reality. He asked her to list her income, her expenses, her housing, her kids' schedules, every barrier, every stressor. And they built the plan from that. Together. They didn't talk about down payments. They talked about survival math. About how $7 worth of bulk oats could replace $28 worth of processed breakfast snacks. About how to write a rental negotiation email that didn't sound desperate, just firm. About how to get free childcare credits through a program she didn't know existed. 3 months later, Marisol had an emergency fund. 6 months later, she had a line of credit. 9 months later, she quit one of her jobs and took a certification class instead. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Diego once, arms crossed. He didn't answer with a speech. He just slid his original notebook across the table. "Because I was you." That was enough. She joined the MAP project as a mentor the following year. The more Diego taught, the more he learned. Because financial literacy wasn't about explaining terms. It was about translating shame into strategy. People didn't need to be told to stop spending. They needed to understand why they spent. Why comfort food was easier than a budget spreadsheet after a 12-hour shift. Why payday loans felt like lifelines, even as they drained you. Why saving felt useless when your life had never once felt safe. Diego started keeping a second notebook, a red one, this time. He called it the Math of Dignity. Each page had one equation. $15 saved equals a night of sleep without panic. $90 buffer equals the courage to ask for a better job. $1,000 emergency fund equals a new spine, a new voice, a new sense of self. He wrote them like poetry, like scripture, not because they were perfect, but because they were personal. They reminded him that every financial lesson was really about power, not control over others, but over your own narrative. One morning, Diego was invited to speak at the local high school. He was nervous. It wasn't his crowd. He wasn't flashy, didn't have a presentation, but he showed up with 3 props: a receipt from his grocery budget in 2009, a photo of his first duplex, and a notebook. He spoke softly, but firmly. You don't need a degree to build wealth. You need a system. You need time. You need discipline. And you need someone who won't let you forget that your choices matter, even when they feel small. Then he showed them the red notebook. Read 3 pages aloud. There was silence. Deep, heavy silence. Then the first question came. How do I start if I don't know anything? He smiled. You start anyway. You learn on the way. Ignorance isn't a barrier. It's a beginning. They lined up after. Asked about savings accounts. About rent hacks. About how to convince their families that saving $5 was still worth it. And one boy, no older than 17, said, "My dad's in debt. I think I can help him now." Diego wrote his name down. Gave him a copy of the starter map. Another ripple. That year, Diego began writing more formally. Not for YouTube, not for workshops, but for the ones who might never show up to either. He called the series Small Money, Big Moves. It included case studies from real people who started with less than $100, budget templates with dignity first language, journaling prompts like, what does wealth feel like in your body? And what's the first memory you have of money? A bonus section called, if you've ever felt too far behind. He distributed it through libraries, nonprofits, barbershops, daycares, food pantries, any place that served the working class. He made it free, funded the printing from 1 month of rental income. Because some wealth you don't measure in dollars. Some wealth is seeing someone fold your booklet, tuck it into their purse, and walk out standing straighter than when they came in. That's dignity. And that's what Diego had spent his life buying back, not just for himself, but for anyone willing to reach for it. Late one evening, he stood in front of his bookshelf, sipping tea, scanning the spines. Finance, philosophy, construction manuals, journals. His eyes landed on the red notebook. He pulled it down, flipped to the last page. It was blank. He stared at it for a moment, then picked up a pen and wrote, if the numbers don't make you feel powerful, keep going. If the plan doesn't give you peace, rewrite it. If the life you're building feels like a prison, choose another door. You are not behind. You are building. And the math, your math still matters. He closed the book, set it gently on the shelf, and exhaled. It was a Thursday. Overcast. Cool. The kind of day that didn't beg to be remembered. No headline. No life milestone. Just a quiet 62 degrees and the smell of earth before rain. But for Diego Ramirez, it was the richest day of his life. Not because of money. Not because of property. Not because of a wire transfer or an inheritance or a windfall. But because of a picnic table, a crooked banner, and a boy who stood up and said, I believe I can do it now. Let's go back. The morning had started like any other. Diego was making breakfast, steel-cut oats, almonds, a splash of honey. He was listening to birdsong outside his open window, absent-mindedly sketching out a new layout for the community pantry he'd been helping build in the next town over. That's when Teresa called. You need to come early. Diego checked the time. It doesn't start until... They're already here. He pulled on his boots and got in the truck. When he arrived at the city park, it was already happening. The first ever map project celebration day, organized not by Diego, but by the students he had mentored. They'd gathered under a series of old pine trees. Someone had strung up a banner that read, "We built this. Financial freedom, start small." Folding chairs were set in a circle. A card table held cheap lemonade and Costco cookies. Handwritten name tags sat next to a pile of Sharpies. Kids played with sidewalk chalk. A playlist hummed from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Diego stood there, stunned. "I didn't know this was happening," he said. Teresa smiled. "We thought it was time you saw what you built." People came over one by one. Deshawn, now running a full-time mobile bike repair business. Carla, renting out her back unit and tutoring math on the side. Julian, just refinanced his triplex and sent his daughter to summer camp with the extra cash flow. Renee brought her sister, who just closed on her first house with a 5% down payment. The table had multiplied. Each student had brought someone new, and that someone had brought another. And that's how legacies grow, not with fanfare, but with roots. Diego sat in the circle. There was no agenda, just stories. Teresa read from a notebook, her very first budget, dated from 2 years ago. I wrote, "My goal is to have $100 in the bank and not panic." That was it. And now, I've got 6 months of expenses saved. And I slept like a baby during my last layoff. Laughter, applause, then silence. Because they all understood what that meant. To sleep without panic was wealth. To breathe without bracing was power. Then Jamil spoke. He just turned 30. A former warehouse worker, now self-employed and mentoring 2 teenagers through his church. He stood, held up his phone. "I want to read something I wrote. It's a journal entry from the night I signed my first lease as a landlord." He cleared his throat. "I thought wealth was something rich people got from their rich parents. But Diego taught me that wealth is what happens when you stop giving fear your paycheck. When you look at your bank account and see proof that your life can be different." He showed me that ownership isn't just about property. It's about owning your time, your choices, your voice. Today I unlocked a front door, and I didn't ask anyone for permission. The circle went quiet. Even the kids playing nearby seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Then the boy stood up, 12 years old, brown hoodie, eyes too serious for his age. "I'm James," he said. "I'm Carla's son." Everyone turned. My mom didn't think she could do this. I watched her cry on the floor when our landlord raised the rent. And I watched her learn how to fight back. She started reading, started writing stuff down. She showed me the notebook she got from Diego. He paused, swallowed. I didn't know moms could be superheroes until then. A few people gasped softly. Even Diego had to look away, eyes burning. James finished. "I believe I can do it now. Like, own a house. Or help someone. Like she did." Applause broke out. But it wasn't loud. It was reverent, like clapping in a cathedral. Later, as the sun started to dip behind the pine trees, someone brought out a cake. It was misshapen, icing smeared awkwardly, and in neon blue letters, it read, "Thank you, Diego. You opened the first door." He didn't want to cry, but he did, just quietly, into a napkin, while someone handed him a plastic knife, and everyone gathered for a photo. They took it with a timer, lined up in front of the banner. Diego at the center, surrounded by people who had once believed they were broken, too late, too behind. Now they were property owners, debt-free, educators, builders, parents raising children with a new blueprint. And all because of a man who once couldn't afford a second plate at dinner, sitting on a mattress on the floor of a 2-door house, writing numbers in a secondhand notebook and daring to believe that maybe he wasn't stuck. That night, Diego walked the long way home. No truck, just his steps, echoing against pavement lit by porch lights and crickets. He didn't speak, didn't listen to music. He let the silence hold him like a quilt. When he got home, he went to the garage and sat at the table. It was still, familiar. He ran his hands over the wood grain. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote, "I think this was the richest day of my life. Not because of a dollar earned, but because I saw my wealth reflected in other people's peace. Today I learned that financial freedom is not the final goal. It's the fuel. What we do with it, who we lift, how we teach, that is the real return." He folded the page and placed it in the red notebook. Page 100. The last page. Then he closed the book and let the day end. knowing that something else had just begun. Diego Ramirez didn't have an office. No downtown space with floor-to-ceiling glass. No receptionist. No corner desk with a leather chair and framed accolades on the wall. His office was a converted garage. Wooden shelves lined with power tools and property folders. A pegboard with wrenches and socket sets arranged like artwork. A whiteboard with 3 columns. Maintain, Minter, Monitor. A cracked mini fridge humming beside an old stool. And in the center, the table. It was here, in this quiet space, that Diego ran his empire. Not a vast one. Not loud. But real. 21 doors. Fully paid off. A system of trust. Stability. Service. No drama. No debt. No noise. This was the portfolio that didn't make headlines, but built lives. It took years to become this boring. And that was a compliment. In real estate, boring meant predictable. Predictable meant scalable. And scalable didn't have to mean more units. It could mean more life. That's what Diego had built. A life that didn't depend on surprises. His properties were all within a 2-hour radius. He knew every block, every roofline, every tenant. He didn't use dozens of apps. Just a few that worked. One for digital rent collection. One for maintenance tracking. A basic spreadsheet for cash flow, reserves, and capital planning. His average occupancy? 96%. Turnover? Low. Tenant complaints? Rare. His secret? Respect. Respect for the people who lived in his units. Respect for the systems he'd created. Respect for the discipline that had gotten him here. Every property had a story. There was the single-family home he bought from a retiring teacher, who left a thank-you note tucked in the kitchen drawer. There was the duplex he nearly walked away from because the foundation was cracked, but he fixed it himself with rebar, concrete, and 3 straight weekends of sweat. There was the triplex he let a former student manage as part of their financial internship. Each one wasn't just an asset. It was a chapter, a memory, a monument to patience. But none were flashy. You wouldn't know he owned them unless you asked. He didn't put his name on yard signs or business cards. Didn't flash his status in conversation. Even now, people often mistook him for the maintenance guy when he showed up to trim hedges or replace a porch light. He never corrected them. He just got to work. Because to Diego, ownership wasn't about being above. It was about being responsible. One Sunday afternoon, Diego was replacing screens on a unit when a tenant approached him. A young woman, college-aged, part-time barista. She looked sheepish. "Hey, you own this place, right?" He nodded. She held up a rent receipt. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've had 4 landlords in 3 years. You're the first one who didn't make me feel disposable." Diego paused, took off his gloves. "Everyone deserves to feel safe where they sleep." She nodded, eyes welling. He didn't need a Yelp review. That moment was the ROI. That same week, Diego sat down to update his portfolio log. He did this quarterly, not just the numbers, but the state of the mission. Each unit had 3 lines underneath. Condition, tenant situation, purpose. He asked himself, is this property still serving the mission? Not just profit, but people, peace. His mission had changed since the beginning. Back then, it was escape the job. Then it was achieve financial freedom. Now, it was simpler. Sustain impact without sacrifice. He didn't want to work harder. He wanted to serve deeper. So when he saw that one of his duplexes was underperforming, and not because of bad tenants or deferred maintenance, but because it was no longer aligned with his values, he made a decision. He sold it, not to the highest bidder, but to the current tenants. He offered them a seller finance deal with no bank involved. "Why are you doing this?" they asked. "Because this property belongs to people like you," he said. "People who care about it, who love it, who've made a home." They closed 6 weeks later, and on the day they signed, they brought him a bottle of lemonade and a card. Inside it said, "You didn't just give us a house. You gave us permission to dream bigger." He framed it, hung in the garage, next to the MAP project banner. That year, Diego's net income dropped slightly. His portfolio shrank from 21 doors to 20. But his peace grew. His time multiplied. His clarity deepened. He spent more afternoons walking nature trails, sat through more community board meetings, helped his neighbor build a chicken coop, hosted 2 MAP project potlucks under a string of fairy lights in his backyard. He realized something powerful. The goal was never passive income. The goal was peaceful contribution. One evening, Diego got a letter. Yes, a letter. Not an email. Not a DM. It was handwritten, postmarked from a nearby town. He opened it slowly, the old-fashioned way. It read, "Dear Mr. Ramirez, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Kenny. I was at your first ever workshop, but I never spoke. I just listened. I took your map. Didn't fill out for a year, but I kept it. Last month, I bought my first house. It's a fixer. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I just wanted you to know. The words you said, about wealth being quiet, about building before you feel ready, those stuck with me. You probably won't remember me, but I remember you. Thank you, Kenny." Diego folded the letter, closed his eyes, sat in silence for several minutes. Then he walked to the shelf, found a frame, and slid the letter inside, hung it above his red notebook, and whispered, "This is the kind of interest I was always trying to earn." The next day, he walked his favorite property. It was a modest triplex on a tree-lined street. One unit was occupied by an elderly couple who'd lived there for over a decade. One by a young teacher, saving for her first home. The third was empty, just turned over. Diego stepped inside to the walkthrough. The walls were clean, carpet replaced, light bulbs working. He stood in the center of the room and looked around. There was no noise, no urgency, no pressure, just space, just enough. He sat on the floor, crossed his legs, and leaned against the wall. Outside, wind rustled the leaves. Inside, he smiled. This was it. The portfolio was no longer about growth. It was about grace. Each property a reflection of a decision made with care. Each tenant a partner in the mission. Each dollar a tool, not a master. And each day, a reminder that wealth is not loud. It is quiet, sustaining, and deeply human. Diego Ramirez never liked the word legacy. To him, it sounded like something reserved for men in suits, for oil portraits and endowments, for families with crests and country clubs, and children pre-registered for Ivy League schools. He didn't grow up around legacies. He grew up around survival. But somewhere around age 46, Diego began to realize that maybe, just maybe, legacy wasn't something you left. Maybe it was something you lived. It started with a question at a local bookstore. He had been browsing the finance section, out of habit more than need, when a young man in his early 20s approached him. Skinny, nervous, hair tied back in a half bun, arms full of dog-eared real estate books. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Diego?" "Diego Ramirez." Diego turned, surprised. "Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be weird. My mom went to one of your workshops 2 years ago. Carla. She's the one who started the tutoring side hustle." Diego smiled. "She used to bring her son," he said. The man laughed. "That was me." They stood there, between shelves of paperbacks and hardcovers, surrounded by the quiet gravity of stories. And the boy, now a man, told Diego what had happened. He'd saved $6,000, opened a Roth IRA, got a part-time job at a nonprofit, and started studying to become a social worker. "Not because of money," he said, "but because I watch what happens when people get their dignity back. I want to be part of that." He held up one of the books. "I still have your map in my desk drawer. The one with the quote, 'Build before you feel ready.'" Diego didn't say much, just nodded, gently. That night, he sat at the table and wrote for the first time. "What is my legacy?" He pulled out a fresh notebook. Not red, not black, forest green, a color that reminded him of roots, of trees, of stability. On the first page, he wrote, "The legacy ledger, a record of what I've planted." And beneath that, not doors, not dollars, not net worth, but names. One by one, he listed them. Julian, Carla, Deshawn, Renee, Eli, Teresa, Jamil, Kenny, and now James. Each name with a note beside it. A date, a detail, a moment when the ripple had begun. As he wrote, he realized something startling. He had helped more than 100 people make their first financial move. Not all had bought homes, but they had opened accounts, started budgets, tried. And trying, Diego knew, was everything. Because no one had taught people like him that trying counted. The next day, Diego walked to the library, not to check out books, but to leave something behind. He asked the librarian, an older man with glasses and a kind smile, if they accepted self-published work. "Of course," he said. "We love community authors." So Diego handed him a manila envelope. Inside, 20 copies of Small Money, Big Moves, freshly printed and bound. "Free for anyone," he said. No late fees. No strings. The librarian opened one and read the dedication. To the version of you that thinks it's too late, it's not. He looked up. This is going to matter to someone. Diego nodded. I hope so. Back in the garage, Diego rearranged the wall first. He'd run out of space. So he added a new panel, just a corkboard nailed into the studs, raw and unfinished. But each photo made it shine. Families in front of duplexes. Single moms holding sold signs. Young couples holding hands on rental porches. And in the middle, he pinned a Polaroid of the table, taken during a Thursday night mentorship circle. Fairy lights overhead. Everyone laughing over cups of coffee. That was the legacy. Not the deals. Not the portfolio. But the people. The ripple. The invitation. One Saturday, Diego received an email from a woman in another state. Her name was Gloria. She had found his YouTube channel through a friend, downloaded his free starter kit, and started saving using the envelope method. I just wanted you to know, she wrote, that I've been sleeping better. I think that's worth something. Diego replied, it's worth everything. He realized, in that moment, that legacy was not about being remembered. It was about creating the conditions for others to remember themselves, to reclaim power, to trust their instincts again, to say, maybe I can do this. That fall, Diego gave his first ever talk at a local college. He didn't use a slideshow. He brought 3 things: a paint-splattered notebook, a bag of budget envelopes, a used wrench. He held up the wrench first. This, he said, is how I build my income. He held up the notebook. This is how I kept it. And then the envelopes. This is how I kept myself sane, while building something that looked impossible. The students sat forward in their seats, some skeptical, some already in debt, some taking notes like they were in church. One asked him, why didn't you go bigger? Diego paused, smiled. I did. I just grew inward. After the talk, a professor approached him. We'd like to archive your workshop materials, she said, for future students. Would you be willing? Diego hesitated. He wasn't a formal educator, didn't have certifications or degrees. But the professor insisted. This is the kind of education they need. Real, practical, grounded in lived experience. So he agreed. Later that week, he donated his original red notebook, the first 3 versions of his starter map, and a thumb drive with his financial independence story told in his own voice. He watched as they placed it in a box labeled Community Economics, the People's Archive. He stood there, staring, not out of pride, but humility, because the man who once feared overdraft fees was now being studied. Back home, he added a new entry to the green notebook. Page 43. Legacy isn't a name on a building. It's a name whispered in a kitchen. When someone says, I think we'll be okay. That night, he left his garage door open. The neighborhood was quiet. A breeze moved through. He sat at the table, eyes closed, listening to the wind. He imagined 20-year-old Diego sitting across from him, hungry, tired, afraid. He imagined sliding the green notebook across the table, saying, you did it. You built something that outlives you. Not in concrete, but in confidence, in letters, in light bulbs that stay on, in moms who don't cry over groceries, in sons who believe they can. And for once, that younger version didn't cry. He just smiled, finally, at peace. Diego Ramirez once read that every decision we make is a fork in the road, a split in the universe, a tree branching off into infinite futures. Some people made decisions by gut, some by fear, some, like the old Diego, by necessity, trying to make the least painful choice with the fewest dollars in his pocket. But now, at 46, with no debt, no boss, no looming deadlines, his decisions had started to feel different, more deliberate, more spacious. He didn't have to choose between survival and stress anymore. Now he was choosing between versions of his purpose. And one choice, in particular, had been sitting in the back of his mind for nearly 6 months. It arrived by email, then again by certified letter. A development firm had offered to buy 2 of his remaining triplexes. Cash, above market, no contingencies, quick close. The properties were in a neighborhood where real estate values had exploded, up 80% in just 7 years. New cafes, bike lanes, a co-working space where a laundromat used to be. To most investors, the offer would have been a no-brainer. Liquidate, reinvest, retire even more comfortably. But to Diego, it wasn't about the numbers. It was about the tenants, the families who lived in those units. The retired widow who had tended the shared garden behind Unit B for 5 years. The single dad in Unit C who paid rent on time, never complained, and whose son left chalk drawings on the sidewalk every Saturday. What would happen to them? Would the new owners raise rent? Convert the buildings? Flip them into high-end ARMs? He stared at the letter again, sitting at his kitchen table in the same chair where he used to clip coupons and calculate grocery lists with military precision. Now, he was calculating something else. The price of protection. He called his property manager, Sheila. "What would you do?" he asked. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Well, if you were a spreadsheet, I'd say sell. But you're not a spreadsheet." "No," he said. "I'm a steward." That word sat heavy. And true. He'd spent his life trying to own. Now he realized he had also been entrusted. Entrusted with homes, with systems, with people's safety. And he couldn't sell them out for a return. That night, he sat in his garage under the dim light of the hanging bulb, opened a blank page in his green notebook. At the top, he wrote, "The decision tree." He drew a line down the middle of the page. Left column, sell. Right column, keep. Under sell, he wrote, immediate $420,000 profit. Simpler portfolio. More liquidity. Freedom to travel more. Under keep, he wrote, stability for tenants. Honor stewardship. Continued community trust. Opportunity to mentor future owners from within. He stared at the page for a long time. Then, next to the sell column, he wrote in small print, "At what cost?" And next to keep, he underlined, aligned with mission. He closed the notebook. Decision made. The next morning, he sent 2 emails. To the developer, "Thank you for your offer. I've decided not to sell at this time." To his tenants in both buildings, "Just wanted to let you know, I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." One tenant wrote back, "I read this on my lunch break and started crying. Thank you for choosing us." That, Diego thought, was wealth. The kind that couldn't be taxed or tallied. But that choice sparked another idea. What if he could pass the properties on? Not to a corporation, but to the community itself. What if he created a model for in-community succession? Over the next month, Diego met with a financial planner, an estate lawyer, and a nonprofit housing advocate. He learned about land trusts, seller finance co-ops, and legacy contracts. He read case studies of landlords transferring ownership of buildings to groups of long-term tenants. He made spreadsheets, drafted models, asked hard questions. Could it work? Could he legally and sustainably offer first right of refusal to his tenants? Could he design a gradual buyout plan that didn't destabilize anyone? The answer, surprisingly, was yes. With the right legal scaffolding and the right coaching, his triplexes could become the seed of something bigger. A community-owned pocket of permanence. Diego was stunned. He had stumbled into something he hadn't even known he was searching for. A way to turn personal finance into collective empowerment. A way to ensure that when he was gone, the people in those buildings would not be replaced, but uplifted. He started with a simple invitation. A dinner at his house. Outdoor table. Big pot of arroz con pollo. Iced tea in mason jars. String lights overhead. He invited the residents of both triplexes. No pressure. No pitch. Just a conversation. They ate. Laughed. Shared stories. And then, as dessert was served, Diego stood up and cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot about the future. Not mine, ours." He explained the idea of tenant-owned co-ops, of gradual ownership, of forming a small housing trust that would allow them to buy the buildings over time, with his support. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the widow said, "You'd really do that? Let's own this place." Diego nodded. "If you want it. If you're willing to learn. I'll walk with you every step." One by one, the heads around the table began to nod. The next 6 months were slow. Meetings, workshops, confusion, breakthroughs. Diego taught the same way he always had. At the table, with a dry erase board, with metaphors and patience. They learned how mortgages worked, how HOAs functioned, how maintenance reserves protected everyone. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The tenants became owners in training. They began noticing things differently. One offered to help paint the back stairwell. Another replaced a broken window before it was even reported. Someone planted herbs in a shared yard. And no one missed a single rent payment. Not because they feared eviction, but because they believed in the foundation they were laying. Diego felt something shift in him. He was no longer a landlord. He was a gardener of autonomy, and the soil was rich. One day, he sat with Jamil, now the owner of 4 units himself, and showed him the succession plan. Jamil flipped through the documents slowly. "Diego," he said, voice thick, "this isn't just real estate. This is revolution." Diego smiled. "No, it's restoration." That night, he updated the green notebook. Page 60. A tree doesn't worry about who sits under it. It just grows wide enough to give shade. He put the pen down, sat in silence, and felt, perhaps for the first time, that he hadn't just retired from something. He had retired into something. A mission, a calling, a legacy that would outlive him. Not by fame, but by function. And in the end, wasn't it the richest form of freedom? The truth about exits is this. The most meaningful ones don't come with applause. They come quietly, after long periods of clarity. They aren't escapes. They're transitions. Diego Ramirez had thought a lot about exits. When he left the job site at 35, he thought that was his big one. Leaving construction, hanging up his hard hat, punching out for the last time. But what he hadn't realized then, what only time and stewardship could teach, was that financial independence is not the final door. It's the hallway to many others. And at 47, Diego found himself standing in front of a new threshold. He didn't feel tired. He felt ready. Ready to hand over more than just keys. Ready to hand over the system. It started with an audit. Not a tax audit. A personal one. Every January, Diego reviewed his portfolio, what he called the system review. But this year, he didn't just assess his cash flow, maintenance backlog, and reserves. He asked a bigger question. If I couldn't run this tomorrow, who could? That question hit harder than he expected, because up until now, the system had lived inside him. His mind, his notebooks, his patterns. Sure, he had spreadsheets, procedures. His property manager could handle logistics. But the heart of the mission, the mentorship, the intentional stewardship, that was Diego. And that was a problem, because even freedom needs a succession plan. He created a file titled Exit_01, Legacy Transition Draft. At the top, he wrote, "Goal, transfer ownership of my financial freedom ecosystem without diluting its soul." He broke it down into pieces. 1. The properties. Who would maintain them? Who would inherit them? What structure could preserve them for community use? 2. The map project. How would it live on without his voice guiding each new student? 3. The mentorship model. Could someone else sit at the table and do what he did? 4. The philosophy. How could he make sure the why didn't get lost in someone else's how? Over the next 6 months, Diego began building his exit in layers. First, he trained 2 apprentices, not from some elite finance circle, from a neighborhood. Jamil, the former warehouse worker turned landlord, and Teresa, the single mom who became one of his first MAP graduates. He created a curriculum, met with them weekly, taught them not just how to calculate ROI, but how to read people, how to say no to a predatory lender, how to guide someone gently from panic to planning, how to use silence when someone's shame filled the room. He gave them the binder templates, the teaching stories, the failures, the quiet wins, and most importantly, he made them promise one thing. You don't teach for applause. You teach because someone taught you. Then he addressed the map project. It had grown beyond what he ever imagined. From a few notes scribbled in a library basement to a living network of more than 300 people. Renters, first-time buyers, small landlords, budgeters, parents teaching their kids how to track grocery spending. He knew it couldn't remain informal. So he filed to turn it into a 501c3, a real nonprofit, with a board, with structure, with funding possibilities. And he didn't put his name in the spotlight. He appointed Jamil and Teresa as co-directors, created a rotating chair system to avoid burnout, and wrote the mission statement himself: to multiply dignity by delivering real financial education to those the system left behind. The last piece was the hardest. The portfolio. He didn't want to pass it all to a single person. He wanted it to become a funding engine. So he created a trust, a long-term holding entity designed to generate income from MAP project scholarships, emergency tenant assistance, and down payment grants for program graduates. The properties would stay intact. The rent would keep flowing. But the profits? They become seeds. It took 3 lawyers, 2 revisions, and a lot of patience. But when the papers were finally signed, Diego felt something new. Release. Not detachment, but elevation. He wasn't giving up control. He was giving away capacity. On the first official meeting of the new board, Diego didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat at the side, notebook in hand, silent, watching. Teresa opened the session. Jamil gave the financial report. A new member, Carla's son, James, now 19, presented on their first digital budget coaching pilot. Diego said almost nothing, but he didn't need to, because it was working. The model, the mission, the multiplication. He closed his notebook halfway through and just listened to the sound of his life, repeating in others. Weeks later, he visited one of his first properties, the duplex with the green trim, the one where it all began. It looked nearly the same, except for the new flower bed and the plaque. It was small, metal, mounted discreetly on the porch railing. It read, "This home helped fund freedom for more than 300 families. May its walls continue to hold wisdom." Diego hadn't put it there. One of the tenants had. He stood there for a long time, not out of nostalgia, but reverence, because in that moment, he realized something profound. The richest exits are the ones you don't need to narrate. They're already telling themselves. That evening, he sat at the table. Just him. No mentorship circle. No workshop. No whiteboard. Just a candle, a mug of chamomile tea, and the green notebook. He flipped to the final section, wrote at the top, "Exit complete, with dignity." And underneath, "My name doesn't need a last, but the map will. The idea will. The math of quiet courage will. I am no longer the center. I am now the soil, and I trust what I planted." He closed the book, blew out the candle, and walked out into the night air. Nothing had ended. It had only evolved. At the corner of Maple and Sycamore, behind an iron fence rusted with time, stood a modest 2-bedroom house with faded white siding and a front porch held up by love more than lumber. It was the house Diego Ramirez grew up in, and it had never belonged to his family. Not really. They had rented it from a man they never saw, paid in cash, handed envelopes through screen doors, lived under the constant possibility of a knock on the door that meant change. Eviction notices, rent hikes, sales. Diego had laid on that floor as a kid, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it felt like to wake up in a home no one could take from you. That feeling, more than compound interest, more than early retirement, was the fuel behind everything he built. Not wealth, not status, but permanence. And now, at 47, he had returned, not as a tenant, but as the buyer. It started as a whisper from a neighbor. Mr. Cortez, who still walked his dog past the block every morning, casually mentioned that the old place was going up for sale. Owner passed away last month. No heirs. House will be sold off cheap, I bet. Too much trouble for the big guys. Diego didn't blink. He called the listing agent that afternoon. Cash offer. No inspections. Close in 2 weeks. He walked through the house alone before signing the paperwork. Every floorboard still creaked in the same places. The living room still had the same smell, wood, dust, the echo of time. In the back corner, the closet door was still slightly off hinge, the one that never closed right, even after his father tried to fix it 5 times. He ran his hand along the wall where their old table used to be. He remembered laughter, arguing, rice spilled on the floor, homework done by candlelight, birthdays where no one had money for cake, but someone always found candles. This was not just a house. It was a return. 2 weeks later, Diego signed the final documents and held the keys in his hand. No loan, no cosigner, no closing delays. A house with history, now owned outright. He walked in slowly, quietly, like entering a cathedral. There was no rush to renovate. He wasn't flipping this house. He was reclaiming it. Every corner deserved attention, not just cosmetic but emotional. This was the house where his mother cried when the rent went up in '93. The house where his father lost his job and spent 3 months fixing appliances under the table to make ends meet. The house where Diego learned what lack sounded like, when the fridge was quiet and so was the dinner table. And now it was his. Debt-free, stress-free, his to do with as he pleased. But he knew he couldn't keep it for himself, because that wasn't his mission anymore. The first person he called was James, Carla's son, now nearly 20, training to become a community financial counselor. Want to help me turn something old into something permanent? Diego asked. Always, James said. They met at the house with clipboards and gloves, notebooks and measuring tape, paint cans and purpose. They took photos, measured walls, built a project plan. By spring, the renovation had begun. But this wasn't just cosmetic. They weren't installing granite counters or high-end tile. They were preserving character, fixing what was broken, respecting what was lived in. They kept the original floors, restored the cabinets, turned the back bedroom into a reading and learning space. And in the front room, where Diego's family had once eaten dinner in folding chairs, they built a round table. Not just a symbol, a station. Because this house wasn't going to be rented or flipped. It was going to become something else entirely. The Financial Dignity Center. That's what the sign read when it went up in June. Hand-painted, mounted on a reclaimed post. Simple serif lettering, cream background, bold black font. Inside the house, everything had been reimagined. One room became a teaching lab with desks, whiteboards, and budgeting kits. Another was a coaching room for one-on-one financial sessions. The kitchen remained, because food, Diego knew, was always part of the equation. And the living room, it held stories, photographs, a wall titled, "We Got Free Here." It wasn't a nonprofit office. It wasn't a business. It was a threshold, where financial education met emotional safety, where people could walk in with shame and walk out with strategy, where the word budget stopped meaning restriction and started meaning choice. On opening day, over 40 people came. Some were neighbors. Others traveled from 2 towns away. There was no ribbon cutting. Just Diego, standing in front of the house that raised him, holding a microphone he didn't quite want to use, speaking slowly. This house used to be where my family braced for impact. Rent increases, missed paychecks, layoffs. Now, it's a place where we prepare for liftoff, for planning, ownership, healing. This is the house that taught me fear. Now we'll teach freedom. Not because it's fancy, but because it's ours. Applause didn't erupt. It swelled. Slow. Reverent. Like someone exhaling after holding their breath for a generation. That summer, the Financial Dignity Center hosted its first full workshop series. Debt doesn't define you. Budgeting for the first time, even if you hate math. Single moms and side hustles. Reclaiming time and income. How to read a lease without feeling like you need a lawyer. The $5 start. Building an emergency fund from zero. Each session was full. Every chair. Diego taught a few. But most were led by graduates of the MAP project. Julian, Teresa, Jamil, James. The movement had matured. It was no longer dependent on Diego. He had become the soil, the roots. Now, the tree was blooming. And the fruit, it was feeding families. One night, after a particularly powerful workshop, Diego lingered in the old kitchen. The walls were newly painted, but the bones were the same. He stood by the window, sipping tea, watching a small boy outside draw with chalk on the sidewalk. His mother was inside, taking her first budgeting class. He smiled, walked into the front room, sat at the round table, and pulled out a guest log. At the top, it read, "This house is mortgage-free, but full of worth." He flipped through names. Hundreds now, each one a story, each one a ripple, each one proof that financial systems didn't need to be cold. They could be kind. That weekend, Diego wrote a letter. To no one in particular. Maybe to the house. Maybe to his younger self. Maybe to the child of a future student who might one day read it. It said, "We thought we were trapped because we were renters. But what we were really missing was the language of freedom. This house taught me fear. Now it teaches fluent courage. And I am honored to be one of its translators." He folded it, placed it in an envelope, taped it under the table, for the next generation to find. It was an ordinary Tuesday in early fall, the kind where the leaves flirt with change, but haven't quite committed. The sky had that soft, brushed-over gray that diffused the sun just enough to make the world feel like a memory before it happened. Diego Ramirez had no meetings, no workshop, no tenants to check on, no roof leaks, no calls to return. For once, he had a calendar that didn't pull him in any direction. So he returned to the place where it all started. Not the first duplex, not the tool shed, not even the house he grew up in, but the hill behind Westway Middle School, where he used to ride his busted-up BMX bike after school, where he used to lie on the grass, backpack under his head, and dream, not of millions, not of properties, but simply of a life where money didn't make every decision for him. He parked his truck nearby, walked up the path, and sat at the top of the hill. It wasn't as steep as he remembered. The trees had grown. So had he. In his hands, he held the green notebook. The final page remained blank, and he knew what it was waiting for. He sat for hours, watching cars move, birds dip, clouds shift. There was nothing profound about the view, but the stillness. It had a weight he could feel in his bones. He flipped through the notebook slowly, reading fragments from the life he had documented. Small moves, stacked with intention. You are not late. You are learning. The cost of staying small is who you didn't reach. Peace is the real ROI. Freedom doesn't always look like leisure. Sometimes it looks like usefulness. Each entry was a breadcrumb for someone else to follow. Because the truth Diego had come to understand, after all the deals, all the workshops, all the hours spent wiping sweat from his brow while fixing toilets or mentoring at the table, was this. Financial freedom was never the final destination. It was just the beginning of your usefulness. He thought about his parents, how hard they worked, how little they left behind, but how much they had taught him about showing up, even with empty hands. He thought about James, Carla's son, who was now helping co-lead the Financial Dignity Center, who had just created a mentorship group for teenagers from Section 8 housing. He thought about Jamil, who had helped 2 of his tenants purchase the very duplex they used to rent from him. He thought about Teresa, who was now writing her own budget book for single mothers and distributing it at daycares and health clinics. The model was multiplying, and he was no longer holding it up. He was lifting it from underneath. The soil, not the tree. And that brought him to the last page. He clicked his pen, paused, and wrote, with slow intention, I have nothing left to prove. I have seen what happens when dignity compounds. I have watched people go from panic to power, from just surviving to building legacies of their own. I have made mistakes, early, often, and sometimes expensively. But I stayed. I showed up. I used what I had, a second door, a notebook, and a refusal to quit. And that became enough. My final lesson is this. Freedom is not about the absence of struggle. It's about the presence of choice. And when you have choice, you can become a force for healing. I pray you choose that. I did. He signed the page, closed the notebook, and exhaled. That winter, Diego stepped away from everything. Not with drama, but with design. He left the table in the hands of his apprentices. He assigned his last workshop to be led by a full team of MAP project graduates. He turned off his YouTube comments and set the channel to archive mode. He wrote a simple message on his website homepage. If you're here for a quick fix, I'm not your guy. If you're here to rebuild a life, welcome to the work. Start with the envelope. Start with the $5. Start with the truth. The map is yours now. He spent more time walking the neighborhoods he used to drive through without stopping, not to inspect properties, but to greet people, see how they were living, ask what they needed. One day, an old woman stopped him in front of a bus bench. You're the man who makes people believe again, she said, smiling through missing teeth. He bowed his head gently. I just remind them what they already know. In February, Diego traveled alone to the mountains. No phone, no planner, just snow, pine, silence. He stayed in a tiny off-grid cabin for 4 days, chopped his own wood, cooked simple meals, wrote poetry in the margins of old books. And on the final night, he stood outside in the freezing air, breath curling upward, and looked up at the stars. No rent due, no inbox, no deadline. And for the first time in his life, he felt the quiet inside him match the quiet outside. He smiled and whispered into the wind, You did good, and now you can rest. Let them carry the torch. He returned to town slowly. No fanfare. He didn't need it. His legacy was already in motion. He walked past one of his old triplexes and saw a young man teaching his daughter how to ride a bike in the driveway. Another unit had a vegetable garden where there used to be patchy grass. Someone had painted the fence. He smiled, didn't knock, didn't wave, just kept walking, because it wasn't his to own anymore. It was theirs to live. Years later, long after Diego stopped teaching, someone would sit at the table and read his notebook. They'd trace the words with their fingers and say, I don't know who this Diego guy was, but he got it. They wouldn't need to meet him, because his life had already met them, through the systems he built, the maps he left, the people he trusted to continue the work. They would go on to teach someone else. And so the story would continue. No Netflix special. No viral moment. Just quiet wealth. Transferring not through bank accounts, but through belief. He didn't do it to be famous. He didn't do it to be rich. He did it because he once stared at a ceiling, broke and afraid, and promised himself that he would build a life that didn't end in panic. And he did. Not because he was perfect, but because he stayed the course, used what he had, and shared what he learned. And in doing so, he made a map. Now it's yours. Fold it gently. Write your own steps. And when the time comes, pass it on. If this story spoke to you, take a second to like this video. It helps more people find their way to stories like Diego's. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. We share real journeys like this every week. People turning discipline into freedom. If someone you know needs a reminder that it's not too late, share this with them. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What's your first step toward freedom? Because your story might just be the next one we tell.